Louise Bean with the Blaze Project, Episode 5 of Burning Questions. It's kind of exciting to talk about fires of mythic proportions happening in the grand landscapes of the West, where the mountains, their trees, and their blazes are larger than life. But I want to bring it back closer to home for the majority of us living in the U.S., even out west, who don't see national park postcard views at our back windows. I know many of my listeners are born and bred Midwesterners that have been asking themselves, cool stuff, Lou, but what does any of this have to do with me? Well, every biome has its own relationship with fire. Even if fires occur hundreds of years apart at extremely low intensities, that's still a defining quality that informs us about the kinds of conditions that habitat needs to support the species that live there. These different relationships are referred to as fire regimes. When we think of wildfire, we may picture catastrophic burns in faraway forests. But grasslands and savannas actually have some of the highest fire frequencies on Earth. Grasslands are a pervasive ecosystem that cover about 40% of the planet. But how could a plant as small as a blade of grass outcompete something as large as a tree? Well, while trees are more susceptible to damage by wildfire, grasslands embrace it. Forest fires blaze quickly through grasslands, and their growth structures, which are close to or underneath the ground, prevail and even thrive after the occurrence of fire. Without frequent fire to prevent the growth of shading shrubs and trees, grasslands and savannas could not be the unique cradles of biodiversity that they are. Our culture-wide conversations about carbon sinks largely focus on forests and trees, but prairies and savannas cover so much of the Earth's surface and are also working hard to sequester carbon. Grasses and root systems can extend 6 to 20 feet into the soil. Thus, carbon is stored deep in the ground where it won't be released when it's burnt, as might happen with a tree in a forest. I am so thrilled to share my conversation with today's guest, who holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology and is a professor at Grand Valley State University, specializing in prairie restoration, fire ecology, and disturbance ecology.
Todd Aschenbach, professor of natural resources management at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, West Michigan. So I think my fire origin story really has a couple of distinct starts over the last 25 or 30 years or so. My first exposure to fire in any sense was as an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And I was a student in the College of Natural Resources. And I had taken a short introductory course on wildland fire and, found it interesting. So that was kind of my first exposure. However, it wasn't until I started working as an environmental consultant in the Chicago area that I actually gained practical experience with prescribed fire in managing wetlands and prairies. And we did a lot of burns. And it was really a great experience. And then after that, fire kind of fell by the wayside when I went to graduate school at the University of Kansas, where I studied ecological restoration. And, of course, ecological restoration, fire are intimately related. But I just really didn't have the opportunity to participate on any fires while I was in graduate school. And so I sort of took a little bit of a hiatus. And then the second fire origin, or the second start, I guess, happened about 10 years ago. And I have a colleague that works for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, Jack McGowan-Stinsky. And he had encouraged me to create a wildland fire course at Grand Valley State. And I hadn't taught fire courses before. I had some experience, but by no means was an expert in this area. But through his support and encouragement and help, I obliged, and that course grew into 3 other courses that now provide students with national certifications in wildland fire. And then from that, I also became an on-call wildland firefighter for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and most recently worked on the U.S. Forest Service's Fire Behavior Assessment Team, where I was conducting research on California wildfire. So, the origin, started 25, 30 years ago, kind of took a break, and then kind of really amped up in the last 10 years or so, which have been quite an exciting adventure.
Yeah, I think when I chose to endeavor on this project, I thought a lot about the different paradigms that we have, like culturally, about fire. And one of the things that was very interesting to me as somebody like growing up in a place that was affected by large catastrophic burns, that then interfacing with Midwesterners, I think that there is a conception that fire is something that happens in the West and it's something that happens in the mountains and in the forests. And like we don't have wildland fire in the Midwest. And that's very interesting to me because the more that I've done research on this, and you can correct me if my understanding is a little bit off on this, but the fire regimes of grasslands and prairies mean that there are often more fires, just at a less intense, heat or burning for less amount of time overall. So that's definitely something that I appreciate about your experience that you're bringing to this and your origin story is that you are working primarily in the Midwest and talking about wetlands and grasslands and how fire is also a part of those ecosystems.
There is a big difference, certainly between, Western wildfires, right? We oftentimes think of those things. There's a lot of life and property that's at risk in those situations. Now, and in the Midwest, yeah, we don't talk that much about wildfires. Now, the reality is we have wildfires in the Midwest all the time. The difference is they're typically very small and they don't make the news. I mean, so technically a wildfire is where someone, throws a cigarette, butt out the window and it starts a, 2 meter fire that goes out. I mean, that's technically a wildfire, right? And so those are the vast majority of the kinds of wildfires we have in the Midwest. Now, of course, we've had some big wildfires, that have taken people's lives and property and that sort of thing. No doubt about that. But we don't hear about it as much as the big Western wildfires. And at the same time, out west they have a lot of prescribed fire as well. So yeah, there's some people think it's an either or thing, and really it's a gradient or a continuum of both wildfire and prescribed fire out west and in the Midwest, really.
So what keeps you passionate about wildfire?
Yeah, there's at least a few things. I personally, I just think it's fascinating. There are really so many different aspects to it. There's the ecology, the science, the management, the training, the people, the organizations involved, and really the interactions of all those things together. There's really so much to learn, and I wish I had another lifetime or two to engage in it even more, I guess. Professionally, my students are really a driving force. Most of my students, like a lot of people, they don't know that much about fire. And so it's really great to have the opportunity to open their minds to something so interesting and so unique. They really get excited about fire, and some of them go on to pursue careers in wildland fire, and that's it's really gratifying that way. And then I think where those two things come together, the overall idea of doing good work is something that I'm always passionate about. And whether that work is educating the next generation of folks that are engaged in wildland fire, or protecting people and their property from the destructive forces of wildfire, or using prescribed fire to improve the landscape. It's all good work in my opinion, and it's all very gratifying professionally and personally.
Yeah, wonderful. And so what surprised you about wildfire when you first started?
Um, I I think when I first started, the most surprising thing was that I really didn't give it the kind of respect that it deserved in many ways. In general, I didn't know much about fire, like a lot of people, especially growing up in the Midwest. I didn't know that much about it, or all the interesting aspects. And so my experience had revolved around prescribed fire early on, and really still does today. So I knew fire was an ecological tool. It helped get rid of invasive species in particular, but I didn't know about the intricacies of fire application. That not all fire is created equal. That when you apply fire and how you apply that fire has an impact on how that ecosystem will respond. And without that knowledge, you can waste a lot of time and money on something that really has inherent risk. Um, so I didn't know there was such a thing as fire science, for instance, something that incorporates physics and thermodynamics and chemistry. I just thought fire was fire. And so I didn't really understand it. I didn't, I guess, respect it as much as I should have at some point. I hadn't yet known any wildland fires that had died while working on a fire. So I didn't think about fire firefighter safety as much as I do now. I hadn't seen the destruction that wildfire can leave behind and how that can fundamentally change people's lives. So, I didn't think about how communities can better prepare themselves for wildfires and ultimately lessen their exposure and risk. So I guess my lack of respect is really based out of ignorance. But needless to say, I've learned a lot over the years, and I certainly have a respect for fire in all capacities.
Yeah, and you really hit on a bunch of different topics there, and there's so much good stuff in that answer. But something that really resonated with me as you were speaking is there are just like so many little things about fire science that are almost like there's like this thrilling sense of like, oh my God, like that's so interesting. And like, of course, like one of the small things that like really excited me as I was learning about fire behavior is just, I read that fire burns faster when it's going up a slope. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Things always go faster when they roll down hills. And then
Right.
learning about the fact that, oh, duh, like heat is rising, so it's
Yep.
drying out the fuels that's ahead of it. It's just
Right.
little things like that that are so like thrilling to learn, and there's so many like intricacies in the way that all of the different elements interact with each other too. It
For
is just
sure.
like there's so much to crack open, both scientifically and also with our cultural relationship with fire too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And if you think about ecology in a general sense, there's so many facets, and we often think about ecology or ecosystems as this web of interacting factors. And fire is really the same thing in a way. Oftentimes we try to break it down to this one thing, or you brought up topography. Yeah, topography for sure has an impact on fire, but topography and wind is another interacting factor, and that's there's the management, but then there's the cultural aspect as well. So they're all working together, and that's, like I said, in my opinion, that's kind of the amazing part of it all.
Like you said, it takes multiple lifetimes to really be able to
Yeah.
appreciate all of the
Yep.
different interactions. But yeah, so have approaches and attitudes changed towards fire on a field-wide basis since you first began in the field?
Um, I think they certainly have. When I began, wildfires were mostly smaller and less frequent. In short, wildfires didn't dominate the news cycle like they do today. But now people think about them in a much deeper way. They decide where they're going to live, or rather, not where they're going to live, in part based on wildfire, and they take extra precautions if they live in wildfire country. And I think these are positive changes. So it's definitely up front and center on a lot of people's minds, more than it was, decades ago. As for prescribed fire, when I began, prescribed fire was a much more novel thing. You didn't see it as much. When I was conducting prescribed fires, the public would come around and ask questions, which is great. But it was a completely new thing to them. In part, they didn't know much about it, and actually, more people were against it in part because they didn't know anything about it. Today, it's much more common occurrence. Many conservation organizations apply a lot of prescribed fire. Even private landowners and municipalities, they really want those benefits of prescribed fire on their lands, and so people are much more exposed to it, and it's generally much more accepted today, and that is definitely a positive change over the last 25 or 30 years.
Absolutely. I think my first exposure to prescribed burns was in the case of private landowners, particularly farmers and people working in agricultural industries using it for the soil benefits and stuff too. So,
For
yeah.
sure.
So would you describe for me from your personal experience a moment of wonder that you had either during your research or maybe your field work that stuck with you?
Yeah, I don't think I can necessarily pinpoint one moment per se. Instead, there's really been a continuous fascination with fire that has culminated into this understanding that although fire is universal across space and time, it is also really an individual entity across that space and time. In other words, one fire is not the same as the other. The intensity of a particular fire, how it behaves, and the effect that fire has on its surroundings really depends on many factors interacting together in this amazing alchemy. And these factors come from the past, present, and future. For example, landscape history will help determine what kind of vegetation and therefore fuel is available to the fire. In the presence of fire, that fuel helps determine how much heat is generated and for how long, which impacts things like plant mortality and nutrients. Factors like topography and wind help determine if a fire races across a landscape or if it takes a leisurely stroll, each resulting in its own fire effects. And keep in mind that even on the same landscape, on the same parcel of land, that vegetation and topography can change from one area to another. And so, winds can shift, all these things that change fire in an instant. And so even in across a particular landscape, as a fire has moved through, it doesn't burn the same way in each spot. And therefore the fire effects are different from 1 meter to the next, really, on a particular area. And as I said, the sort of the future of on a landscape also has an impact on fire. Is there a major rain event right after the fire which washes away the ash and provides some sort of erosion, thereby reducing the subsequent growth of vegetation and therefore fuel for the next fire? Or is there a drought that prevents those seeds in the soil from germinating, which again are preventing the growth of fuel for the next fire? So how an area is managed after a fire can impact the next fire that comes along. So yeah, I guess my overall wonder is the realization that fire is really unique at a very small scale.
Absolutely. Well, cool. So sort of moving into then talking about, the more unique situations that fires can encounter, we have almost exclusively talked about fires in forests on the podcast so far. So this week we're really going to hone in on grasslands, and I think that the majority of the people who listen to this podcast, just being my buddies from the Midwest here from Columbia College Chicago and the students at South Loop Elementary School, we are more familiar with prairies. They're the things that are surrounding us, prairies and wetlands and grasslands. So I really want to get into how fire has a unique relationship with those ecosystems. And unfortunately, only 2,500 acres about of Illinois' original 22 million acres of native grasslands are remaining. So can you tell me what happened to the Midwest grasslands and prairies?
Yeah, I mean, really only a fraction of those original prairies exist. And there's certainly several things that happened. First off, much of them, of course, were plowed under in order to use that rich prairie soil to grow agricultural crops. And if you think about it, it really made sense from a labor perspective. You didn't have to first clear trees or drain a wetland. You just needed a plow. And you plowed up that soil, you planted your crops, and you had great yields from that particular soil. So it's kind of a victim of its own richness, if you will, from a soil perspective. And then following that, a history of fire suppression really took its toll on any remaining prairies. Smokey Bear said wildfire is bad, which, yes, wildfire can be extremely destructive. Unfortunately, Smokey Bear's message was taken as all fire is bad. And this mentality that all fire is bad prevented fire from being used as a necessary management tool in prairies, resulting in the invasion of trees and shrubs taking over those particular areas. And in a sense, if you don't have fire, you don't have prairie. And so we really suppressed fire at every turn, and that allowed these prairies to turn into something else, basically. And then, of course, there's other things that have really harmed the remaining prairies as well. Things like non-native species invasion, nitrogen deposition, fragmentation of the landscape, which leads to a lack of biological connections between the few existing prairies that are out on those landscapes. So seeds aren't able to distribute from one prairie to the next. Animals that live in one prairie aren't able to connect with other animals that live in a prairie 10 miles away, right? They have to cross roads and agricultural fields and subdivisions, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, those are kind of some of the main things that have really hammered the existing prairies. But I like to say we're getting better.
So you said within your answer that our grasslands, when they aren't affected by fire, we start to sort of lose some of those species that are characteristic of those ecosystems because they get shaded out by the growth of shrubs and trees. And this sort of then pulls into this idea of disturbance ecology. And much of your research on ecological restoration has incorporated this idea of disturbance ecology. So I'm wondering if you can describe for our listeners what disturbance ecology is and how wildfire factors into it.
Disturbance ecology is the study of ecological changes in a system that results from a particular disturbance. So, of course, that disturbance can be really minor. For example, a single tree getting blown over in the woods, or it can be really major. Think hurricanes that really pretty much destroy, at least in the short term, entire landscapes. But in general, disturbances are necessary to maintain biodiversity. For example, because that one tree fell over in the woods, there's now more sunlight to reach the forest floor in that particular area, which allows a different suite of sun-loving plant species to germinate and grow, resulting in additional species and increased biodiversity in that forest system. Now, without disturbance, there would be only a relatively small suite of species that would thrive in that system that isn't a state of constant ecology, if you will. So disturbance allows for a diversity of conditions. And because you have a diversity of conditions, you have a diversity of species that are able to utilize those conditions. And as it pertains to my research, it, of course, incorporates disturbance in the form of fire. And specifically, it examines the impact of fire season and order on prairie and savanna management. So naturally, wildfire could have occurred at any time of the year. As long as there is enough fuel and appropriate weather conditions, you could get fire. So in West Michigan, for instance, depending on the weather, this means that wildfire could occur as late as December or as early as February. So there's, again, practically year-round, even in a northern Midwest state such as Michigan. Now, we understand the need for fire in managing prairies and savannas and appropriately prevent and suppress wildfires. Therefore, we have to rely on prescribed fire. So my research revolves around prescribed fire, right? Unfortunately, the vast majority of prescribed fires only occur in spring. And whereas conversely, my research evaluates the impact of fire in other seasons, such as summer and fall. So I'm effectively examining the impacts of expanding that burn window, if you will. I also incorporate fire order into my research. So again, naturally, wildfire may have occurred during the spring one year, and then a couple of years later, it might have occurred during the summer, and then a few years later, it might have occurred in the fall, right? So it changed from season to season naturally, again, depending on the weather and fuel conditions. If you had a drought in a particular area and lightning struck the ground, you perhaps would get a fire. And again, that could have been year round. So instead of applying prescribed fire during the same season year after year, usually spring, as I said, is often done, I'm basically changing up the order to see what happens if we have a spring fire one year, and then a couple of years later we have a fall fire, and then a couple of years later we have a summer fire. So ultimately, I'm really attempting to replicate more, quote, natural fire regimes by varying both the season of fire and the order in which that seasonal fire is applied. And the general hypothesis is that these different burn regimes will differentially impact individual plant species. And then the application of this research is that conservation managers that apply fire can then use the treatment that meets their ecological goals, such as increasing native plant diversity, decreasing invasive species, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, I like to say that diversity begets diversity. So yeah, in this case, I'm using a diversity of disturbance to promote biodiversity.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes this particularly interesting to me as well is that, we have in the US for longer than we have been encouraging encouraging restorative fire, we have been suppressing fire. And so, of course, like there's going to be gaps in our knowledge because we've only really, in the grand scheme of things, just started to see what a tool fire can be. And like that's why I want everybody, that this project is touching to get really excited about fire because this is research that's actively happening right now. And we're gaining a better understanding constantly. Like, we're talking about fire behavior and we're talking about modern management strategies, but these are things that are constantly being researched, and I am super excited. That's fascinating to hear about how we can better emulate the fire regime in our practices that are man-made, but they can be even closer and even closer to what they should be naturally.
Yeah.
That's
So
so cool.
there's a lot to learn, and we're learning a lot all the time, basically. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword, in the sense that there's a lot to learn, and so there's a lot of cool research and experiments that are going on to kind of understand these particular things. So that's the positive aspect. The negative aspect is we don't have answers for a lot of these things. So it takes some time, and fire research by default is really kind of a long-term process. You can imagine if you implement a fire one year or have a wildfire, that plant community has to take at least a year before things are going to be growing back. And then when you consider the long-term aspect of fire across a landscape, well, now you're talking multiple years. So by default, it can be a little tricky, and by default, it's long term, if you will. But nevertheless, we're learning a lot, and it's really exciting.
Absolutely. So let's dig into describing what the beneficial impacts of fire are on a grassland ecosystem. We sort of listed them off, but I really want to get into the nitty-gritty, particularly of its importance to the soil and the species that rely then on that soil, both the grass and the critters.
Right. Yeah. So certainly, several benefits to fire and grassland ecosystems. As it relates to disturbance ecology, again, it can lessen the dominance that a relatively few species might enjoy in that particular area, and therefore provides the opportunity for different species to exist in that same prairie. So again, it allows for diversity to be maintained and expanded in a lot of ways. So that relates to disturbance and diversity in a general sense. The most direct benefit is that it kills many invasive species that don't belong in that grassland, the ones that aren't adapted to fire. So we had mentioned earlier some of the trees and shrubs that tend to move in or invade a prairie that has not been subjected to fire. Well, if you reintroduce fire in those areas, that fire can take out some of those trees and shrubs and open things back up. Now, fortunately, at the same time, it doesn't harm the fire adapted species because those species have most of their resources underground. So if you think about tall grass prairie, for instance, when you look at big blue stem or something, you're seeing 20-25% of the biomass of that plant above ground. The rest is really underground. And so what fire does is it gives those species a haircut. It doesn't really hurt them. It doesn't destroy them by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, these systems really require fire. And that fire literally allows many seeds in the soil to see the light of day, rather than being buried under a thick layer of dead leaves and that sort of thing. And so prairies in particular, their fire return interval might be 2 to 5 years, right? So in other words, fire naturally, in a sense, returns to those systems. And during that time, it takes out some of those woody species that might have crept in and opens up the soil surface to allow some of those seeds that have been lying in underneath the thatch to really germinate and grow. It also releases nutrients back into the soil, right? So you think about that all organisms are in part really a collection of stored nutrients. And it's kind of weird thing to think about, but we're a collection of stored nutrients as well, right? And so when something dies, those nutrients are slowly released back into the soil through decomposition. Well, fire is really kind of just a really fast version of decomposition in a lot of ways. And therefore, fire returns many nutrients back into the soils through the ash for uptake by other plants and soil organisms in a very rapid sense. So it's effectively rapid decomposition. And it can also remove some nutrients from the ecosystem, which at one level sounds like a problem. However, one of the things that we talked about is nitrogen deposition as being a threat to prairie. So in other words, too much nitrogen deposition, aerial nitrogen deposition, right? And so what fire does is it can remove some of those nutrients, in particular, certain forms of nitrogen by way of volatilization, right? Effectively, it evaporates these nutrients and removes them from the system. So it decreases the nitrogen in that system. And so that nitrogen that was typically benefiting many non-native plant species, it's now removed, and that therefore it takes away that advantage to those non-native plant species and really kind of shifts that competitive balance back towards the native plant species. Okay. So those are some of the general things that that fire provides for grassland systems in particular.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, on the topic of there being excess nitrogen in the soil. I feel like there has been a lot of cultural conversation about the harms of fertilizers, particularly like talking about algal blooms and stuff like that as well, which is of course a separate issue about watersheds. But is some of this nitrogen also being deposited because of the use of fertilizers, or how are we seeing most of this be deposited in the soil?
So certainly nitrogen, we've increased the amount of nitrogen in our world basically through agriculture. So there's certainly nitrogen added to agricultural fields. That nitrogen can find its way into waterways. But we also have nitrogen that's deposited through nitrogen oxides. So coal, oil, gas burning, effectively fossil fuels. And so as we add that to the atmosphere, we end up adding more nitrogen. Another offshoot of that is acid rain, right? Mm-hmm. So when those nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides combine with precipitation, you end up with acidic precipitation, effectively, and acid deposition as well, which is another issue that certainly related to waterways in particular. But yeah, there's a lot of sources of nitrogen out there, and agricultural excess agricultural applications is one of the ways that it gets in our systems.
For sure. And I think that's like an interesting moment that complicates our understanding of how fire can fit into stewarding our lands. Because, I think that because fire also does emit carbon when it burns, I think that it can be seen as sort of an enemy when it comes to fighting the impacts of climate change. But that is sort of an interesting complication to it, that it does remove nitrogen in soils, which is also being deposited there because of fossil fuels too. So it's never
right.
dry.
Right.
But yeah, so humans have had a relationship with fire for our entire, existence as a species, and maybe even further back than that, with other species of, within our family tree. And so it's hypothesized that we brought it across, with us to North America. And so there have been groups like the Mississippian peoples and the Folsom peoples who obviously knew how to wield fire to benefit themselves. And then those traditions have stayed through First Nations, who all have their own prescriptive burning and cultural burning strategies. And we're using it again today. We're using prescriptive burning to steward our landscapes again. So I'm curious if you could talk about how fire has been employed as a tool to control grasslands and describe what these control tactics have looked like and how they've changed over time.
Right. I can't really speak to the particular tactics, employed generations ago by, indigenous cultures, aside from certainly knowing that we've used fire for a very long time. It's perhaps our use of fire is practically as old as is our human existence, so to speak. But in general, we've evolved from being from our tactics being quite crude to a bit more advanced. Now that said, we still use some pretty low tech stuff on fires, but but we've certainly advanced. So, for example, I have this picture of Aldo Leopold, and him and his crew are conducting a prescribed fire in 1945 at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And Aldo is dressed in typical farm clothes, while the rest of the folks look like they just came from class. They're all dressed pretty nicely. One of the women has a dress on, and so and the only equipment that they have it appears to be brooms wrapped with burlap sacks, right? And they're dipped in water to smother any flames. But that's it. That they like I said, they look like they came from class. They don't really have any equipment. I think Aldo's the only one that has a pair of gloves on, even. And so. Needless to say, I wouldn't exactly call that adequate, personal protective gear or particularly effective firefighting equipment, right? And that was in 1945. Now today we certainly have certified wildland firefighters that wear fire-resistant clothing. We have backpack sprayers, trucks and UTVs that have big water tanks and pumps and hoses and extensive radio communication, both on site and with local fire departments. We have weather forecasts that can give you accurate and real-time information on a very small area in the burn area. So yes, things certainly have evolved. Unfortunately, much of the evolution in gear and tactics has been the result of injuries and fatalities related to fire, which has prompted us to better evaluate how we can fight wildfires or conduct prescribed fires much more safely. And with fire in general, we're certainly still learning and evolving.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I haven't heard of this like example that early on. Like you talked about there being an example of a study being conducted on prescriptive burns in the 40s. And it's difficult to ascertain from the sources that are available on the internet about the history of fire ecology when it sort of starts to become something that scientists are studying, because for the most part, when you look at the history of US policy on fire, the paradigm that is dominant is suppression. So I'm curious if you know how long ecologists have been studying fire's relationship um, to like habitat health, I guess.
Related to human history, I would argue that the study of fire and ecology started with indigenous cultures, right? It depends on how you define studying, right, and applying fire and that
So
sort of
true.
thing. Now, of course, if we advance further on, certainly I would say in more contemporary times, yeah, we primarily focused on fighting wildfires, and we saw a lot of growth, especially in the early 1900s. In particular, the U.S. Forest Service, they were working to fight wildfires, again, primarily out west, and that's where our gear and tactics certainly evolved, in part because of fatalities, as I had mentioned before. And in part, but with that transition to prescribed fire, I think really coming back to Aldo Leopold, I'm originally from Wisconsin, and so Aldo is really a mentor from the past for me, I guess.
Hmm.
But really, so Aldo Leopold and others created the first restoration project in the world, and that was in the late 1930s. And so restoration is a very new field. The oldest restoration site is not even 100 years old. And related to that restoration, the understanding is that fire is a necessary part of these grasslands, these prairie restorations. And so there's a lot of overlap between restoration kind of starting as a field, so to speak, as a profession, if you will, and the exploration of prescribed fire. So I would say in the mid 1900s is really when we really started looking at fire as a really important ecological tool to apply to the landscape, not just suppress it and prevent it. Now, granted, we still did a lot of that as well. We didn't accept fire with open arms everywhere. I mean, we still don't today.
Hmm.
That makes sense in a lot of ways. But yeah, the mid 1900s, with the rise of ecological restoration, or the start of ecological restoration, I think coincides nicely with the use and study of fire as a positive entity.
Absolutely. And the first part of your question definitely does, address like my bias too in that
Right.
moment, because we really have been, we have been, we may not have called, it the scientific method the entire time that we've been around as human beings, but we are always tampering with the environment to see what
Right.
kind of resources we can access, and, how to best care for the species around us. And I think humans have always just been very curious about our relationship to the things that are happening, like in our
Yeah.
ecosystems.
It ends up being almost a question of when did somebody name something,
Yeah.
even though we've been doing it before we named it, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's interesting evolution and idea of saying when did something start, right?
Hmm. Totally. And just to wrap up today, because we've had an amazing conversation, what do you wish that more people knew about wildfire aside from all this incredible information that we've already talked about today?
Oh yeah, I mean, in general, I think I just like people to have more respect for fire and really less fear, to work with it instead of against it, to learn more about fire in order to really understand it so we can use it instead of it using us. Uh, as for respecting wildfires, I think that means understanding that wildfire is less of a question of if a wildfire will occur, and really more of a question of when a wildfire will occur. And if we respect that reality, we can better prepare for it rather than just living in the fear of the supposed unknown, even though we know it's a known entity. And in terms of respecting prescribed fires, I think that means understanding that fire is not just one monolithic thing, but instead a complex, powerful, beautiful, and paradoxically speaking, a life-giving force.
If you made it to the end, thank you so much for listening. I know today's episode was a long one, but I just couldn't bring myself to edit anything out of our wonderful conversation today. And also, before you go, I have an announcement. Blaze will have an interactive exhibit at the Manifest Urban Arts Festival at Columbia College Chicago in the 623 building on May 12th. I'll have more information on room number and time really soon, but mark your calendars, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, from the Blaze Project, this has been Louise Beam.